Red 2 standing by, all for lit and in the green. Welcome back to Goldeneye. We have made it into Severnaya as we saw in the previous mission, but we have unfortunately been captured and are currently in a prison inside the now finished bunker. The only time we actually get to see the Severnaya control bunker in the movie is when Ourumov and Xenia arrive to steal the Goldeneye key. We see Boris heading outside for a cigarette, which is blown out by the arrival of the helicopter. It's very clear that he is the inside man. Natalia only finds this out later on, when she attempts to contact him, but is led into a trap. Natalia managed to survive with a bit of guile and cunning, gradually making her way out and essentially bluffing her way into getting into contact with Boris. She's actually pretty savvy. She doesn't necessarily have the action skills, but she's got a lot of cunning to make up for it. She's definitely considered one of the better Bond girls, probably one of the best in the whole series. It's in the bunker that we find out that Ourumov might feel like he's getting in over his head because he's really put off by Xenia getting way too much pleasure from butchering all the programmers. Ourumov kind of stands out because he's the most normal villain among the lot. He would be a typical Bond villain in an older film along the lines of the renegade General Orlov, but in this one he's got to work with Xenia, a sadomasochistic psycho who crushes men with her thighs and just gets way too much pleasure out of killing. Boris is smarmy, obnoxious, egotistical, but also incredibly funny at the same time. And Trevelyan is the guy with the master plan pulling the strings and a former 00 agent who knows just how to get inside Bond's head. Ourumov it's not necessarily a problem that Ourumov comes across as not quite as interesting. It's an interesting contrast because it's like he's the old Soviet strongman who wants to lead Russia to an age of glory. He's the old style of villain. The world is changing and he's not as effective anymore. And that's actually quite a fascinating touch. At least I think it is anyway. I've been musing on quite a lot about this movie. Just sort of the way everything changed and what it all means, and that was the conclusion I came to about Ourumov, that he's deliberately so normal compared to the others. As if saying that the old guard has moved out, times have changed. The movie does ask the question, are all these things relevant? We find out that Bond is still relevant, but that classic renegade Russian at the time wasn't necessarily seen as relevant. It was a bit of a dead horse trope for a while, really. Anyway, let's get on to our mission. I hope that was somewhat enlightening, and I hope today's lesson will be enlightening too. So, we do have to escape with Natalia, and we also have to recover the CCTV tape, which, amusingly enough, is a copy of Goldeneye on VHS in this. We can, and I will show this, you can actually get a little bit where Bond winds up trying to pull the sick prisoner trick, it doesn't work, and Natalia snarks at him. She's generally not prepared to take any of his crap throughout the movie, which is pretty impressive. Though, Bond pulling the sick prisoner trick is meant to be a distraction, because we actually see the return of a gadget from Live and Let Die, the watch magnet. I'll stop rambling on and we'll get going. Escape is the first priority. Find the staff and casualty lists and the CCTV tape of your capture. If there are any witnesses, try and bring them out as well. Unbelievable, 007. This gets out will be the laughing stock of the international community. As soon as you get back, if you get back, you're getting a performance review. Only completing the objectives will give you a hope of keeping your rather checkered career intact. One can just imagine M bringing up a line from Casino Royale. Christ, I miss the Cold War. If an agent did something like that, he'd have the good sense to defect. You've got your wits, and that's about it, 007. Not much I can do to help you here. You might try to find your equipment again when you escape from the cell, though. It took me a lot of time to get all that stuff together. Grabbed by the Spetsnaz, James. Ooh, sounds painful. Terrible pun, but Today's lesson is going to be a bit different as we wind up discussing the people behind the scenes, because of course it is important to acknowledge all the people who help bring us the James Bond films in a number of ways. I'll fit in as much information as I can. Ideas drifted around here and there for films based on James Bond, but no one really got anything off the ground during the 1950s. With everything going on around the climax adaptation of Casino Royale, Ian Fleming had ultimately sold the rights to the first novel separately from his other books. Those would ultimately wind up in the hands of producer Charles K. Feldman, who would eventually, in 1967, make a very strange film ostensibly based on the novel, but sort of becoming a massive shambles. The rest of the rights would ultimately wind up in the hands of Canadian producer Harry Saltzman, who had decided to take a chance on these rights. But other producers also had an interest in making films based on the books. One of these, Albert R. Broccoli, would team up with Saltzman to create Eon Productions after Broccoli's previous production partnership, Warwick Films, which he ran with Irving Allen, had dissolved. The two also founded Danjak LLC as a parent company for Eon. Danjak is named after Dana Broccoli and Jacqueline Saltzman, the wives of the duo at the time. Albert Broccoli was born in Queens, New York City in 1909. He earned his nickname of Cubby as a reshaping of a nickname bestowed upon him by his cousin in reference to a then popular comic strip character. Broccoli's early life involved a wide range of jobs before he finally entered the world of cinema in 1941. He worked as a gopher on Howard Hughes' film The Outlaw, but very quickly rose through the ranks of the filming world thanks to Hughes' support and influence, even getting some pretty important jobs on The Outlaw. The two formed a lifelong friendship, and in fact, Diamonds Are Forever was inspired by a dream Broccoli had about the ultimately reclusive Hughes being replaced by an imposter. Broccoli would move to England in the 1950s, where he formed the aforementioned Warwick Films with Irving Allen. The British government was providing subsidies for making films with all British casts and crew, so this was seen as a way to make profitable films pretty easily, and on top of that, it was a lot easier to make films in Britain compared to the controls of the Hollywood system. While Warwick Films did make several notable movies, such as The Red Beret and Fire Down Below, it went into decline towards the end of the decade and was dissolved in 1961. The failure of the film The Trials of Oscar Wilde, coupled with arguments between Broccoli and Allen over making the James Bond films, Allen felt they were ultimately not worthwhile, contributed to the company's downfall. However, The Red Beret did in a sense provide a notable core. Broccoli, screenwriter Richard Maybaum, and director Terence Young would work together to bring Bond to the screen once Broccoli partnered with Saltzman. Maybaum was a long-term writer, and Terence Young would direct 3 of the first 4 films. Saltzman had been born in Canada in 1915, but did not know the exact location of his birth as his family moved. It was actually Sherbrooke, Quebec, but he was raised in St. John, New Brunswick, in his early life before the family moved to Cleveland, Ohio. Saltzman would run away from home at 15, join a circus at 17, and travelled with them for some time before moving to Paris to study political science and economics. It was here that his production career began, working as a talent scout for vaudeville houses and allegedly working with French director René Clair. Saltzman would primarily work as a theatre producer in years after the war, but branched out into other ventures along the way as well and eventually settled in film production. He acquired the rights to the Bond films after reading Goldfinger and being excited by the series' prospects. While it took some work to find a star and a director, before eventually settling on Sean Connery and Terence Young respectively, and having to fight a bit to keep Connery in the role, because a number of cinema powers that be weren't too impressed with Connery, Dr. No turned out to be quite popular, despite being made on a fairly tight budget, and From Russia with Love would ultimately build on that. Eon Productions would primarily focus on the James Bond films, with just one non-Bond film produced by them from 1962 to 2013. This film, Call Me Buana, starring Anita Ekberg, is shamelessly referenced in From Russia with Love. A massive poster for the film obscures Krylenko's hideout, and he has an escape route which opens up effectively within the actress's mouth. I bring that up since the relevant scene in the novel actually has a poster of Marilyn Monroe instead, advertising the film Niagara, and the chapter is even titled The Mouth of Marilyn Monroe. Broccoli and Saltzman did produce films independently of one another. Broccoli brought an adaptation of Ian Fleming's children's story Chitty Chitty Bang Bang to the big screen, interestingly starring Gert Frobe as the villain, while Saltzman continued to produce a range of films including 3 based on Len Dayton's own spy character Harry Palmer and starring the good friend of both Sean Connery and Roger Moore, Michael Caine. The Bond films would generally be their biggest successes, but Saltzman ran into trouble during the 70s with a number of his own investments and projects which didn't go particularly well and some didn't get off the ground. Disputes and disagreements, along with Saltzman's own struggles, would lead him to sell his shares in Danjak. There had been a few issues which popped up earlier. Saltzman was responsible for the miscasting of Blofeld in You Only Live Twice, which we shall discuss soon, and almost turned down the title song for Live and Let Die. He wanted a black female vocalist to perform it, which I'm sure wouldn't have been a problem, but George Martin had offered it on the condition that Paul McCartney would sing it since he produced for the Beatles. A compromise was reached, as a version by a black female artist is sung in the Fillet of Soul nightclub during the film, and Wings performed the title theme. And it's absolutely fantastic. Both versions are actually really good. Since Saltzman's departure, Broccoli produced the Bond films on his own up until Goldeneye. His daughter Barbara and stepson Michael G. Wilson have produced the film since then, carrying on the legacy of Eon Productions and Danjak. It was noted that Sean Connery did not get on with either Broccoli or Saltzman, his relationship deteriorating to the point he refused to act if either of them were on set while making You Only Live Twice, while Roger Moore also found Saltzman a little difficult to work with, but liked Broccoli. There is a terrible pun in the name, admittedly. Broccoli did claim that his family had some connection somewhere along the way with actually importing the vegetable in question, but it is highly likely that the broader Broccoli family is named after the vegetable rather than the vegetable being named after the family. Moore recounted a story from making The Spy Who Loved Me, when food supplies delivered to the set turned out to be rotten or expired and looking pretty feral, frankly. Broccoli managed to whip up a whole lot of supplies, including imported pasta. Not exactly sure how he did it, but he managed to pull some strings, get all that food brought in, and cooked spaghetti and meatballs for the entire crew, apparently having a love of cooking. He did have an interesting near miss. He and the other production crew members avoided death during the filming of You Only Live Twice. They were delayed from a flight to attend a ninja demonstration, and that particular plane crashed, killing all aboard. So, strange, but ironically fortunate in some ways. Under Barbara Broccoli and Michael Wilson's leadership, Eon Productions has actually made more than just the James Bond films starting from 2014. Barbara was the one who chose Daniel Craig for the role of Bond, and even supported several of his theatrical projects during breaks in between films. While this move was considered questionable at first, the choice of Craig turned out to be a masterstroke, and the overall Bond franchise has continued its strong performance. In fact, it's the 5th highest grossing film franchise of all time, which is pretty impressive, and of course it is the longest running. It's not just the producers who do the work though. There are so many memorable elements involved in each and every Bond film. If you've watched the older ones, you'll have seen those stunning title sequences with beautiful women silhouetted against the action. That's the work of Maurice Binder, a notable title designer across many films. He is also responsible for the iconic gun barrel sequence, which starts the majority of the films. Apparently, he cobbled together the idea in about 20 minutes and it just sort of clicked. Some things do just work and wind up coming together in a very serendipitous way, I guess. He managed to get a pinhole camera created so he could actually film down the barrel of a .38 pistol in order to get the actual gun barrel effect. Binder worked on Dr. No, and then Robert Brownjohn designed the credit sequences for From Russia with Love and Goldfinger. Those two films share similar elements in their execution of the title sequence, while the silhouettes would become a trademark of Binder's sequences. While he would also work on the films of Stanley Donen and provide sequences for a number of other films, his work on the Bond series title sequences up until License to Kill remain perhaps his best known works. Roger Moore recounted in his autobiography that during shooting for The Man with the Golden Gun, Morris was trying to arrange the title sequence, but some of the pubic hair on one of the nude models was showing in the footage, and he asked her to smooth it down with Vaseline. The model told him to do it. Morris dutifully set about making the necessary adjustments, just as Roger and Cubby Broccoli walked in. Roger, with his typical schoolboy humour and sharp wit, remarked, "I thought the producer got all the perks on this film." Daniel Kleinman has taken over the title sequences from Goldeneye onwards. That film made quite an impact with its Soviet-inspired imagery and expressions of duality. The more unique style given to each film arguably serves better in the modern era, certainly being more tasteful for the times. The impact of moments like the gunfire punching holes in a playing card, merging into a computer screen bearing the words 007 status confirmed, deserve to be as well remembered as Binder's expressions of the series' sexuality. The series might have started off with some pretty humble origins with a budget of around $1 million for Dr. No. Despite this, there are some truly elaborate interior shots, especially the dining room of Dr. No's lair and the luxuriously appointed details of M's office. The style of the film was all down to some clever creativity and very neat disguising of the cheap materials used on the part of the set designer, Ken Adam. Adam was born in Germany in 1921 with the name Klaus Adam, but his family would ultimately leave in 1933. Ken had left Germany a little earlier, during the rise of Nazism. He would study architecture in England and actually became one of only 3 German-born people to fly with the RAAF during World War II. Roger Moore once told some German visitors to one of the sets that Ken, born Klaus Adam, was a skilled air ace who shot down many planes. Of course, Roger conveniently omitted the fact they were German planes Ken shot down. Ken would start work in films after the war, steadily building his skills with a number of set designs, originally working as a draftsman and moving his way up. His creative and clever designs earned him the set designer role for Dr. No, though he could not work on From Russia with Love due to being involved with Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove. His designs for the film earned him a BAFTA, and he would later win 2 Academy Awards. The set of the War Room in Dr. Strangelove is perhaps one of the most memorable locations, and it shows just how good his designs were. While Adam only worked on 7 Bond films, each time he made quite an impact. He was helped out by Sid Kane, who I will discuss a little bit later, but Adam was the mastermind behind the memorable Volcano base set. It took a lot of work and apparently required more steel than the London Hilton. Adam admitted he must have been mad, and the interior shots of Fort Knox, constructed entirely from imagination, and Adam's idea of a cathedral of gold. He then outdid himself with the massive supertanker interior for The Spy Who Loved Me, built on the new 007 stage at Pinewood Studios and helping create a truly grand climax to the film. Moonraker was the last film Ken Adam worked on, and it certainly provided some impressive designs once again, with his work on Drax's launch site and the space station itself holding up to this day. So good was Adam's eye for detail and imagination that he risked getting himself in official trouble while making Dr. Strangelove. His work transposing the details of World War II bombers to create the interior of a then classified B-52 made Kubrick worry that he'd accessed classified documents illegally. While several set designers have worked on the series, odds are if you think of a design from the Bond films, you'll be thinking of Ken Adams' work. He did actually turn down the opportunity to work on 2001: A Space Odyssey, feeling he would be at a disadvantage developing his art given Kubrick had communicated with NASA for a year, but would go on to work with Kubrick in later films and developed a good friendship with him. During The Spy Who Loved Me, when cinematographer Claude Renoir was suffering from failing eyesight, Stanley Kubrick provided secret assistance with the set lighting. Speaking of Sid Cain, he worked on From Russia With Love in the absence of Ken Adam, having already been involved with Broccoli via Warwick Films. He too had begun his cinematic work after World War II and moved up from the role of draftsman. Unlike Adam, he actually had a fairly rough war with the RAF. I may have said RAAF earlier, but that's because I'm Australian and I just flubbed things. Cain survived a plane crash in then Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, which wound up breaking his back, and he also got struck by lightning at one point, so he did a pretty good job surviving all that. Broccoli recruited Cain for the Bond films since he had designed sets for a number of his films already, and overall, across the cinematic world, Cain had been working as an assistant art director before receiving a promotion to the full role after the intended art director for Lolita was injured. He worked on Dr. No but was accidentally left out of the credits. Broccoli gave him a solid gold pen in exchange since the budget was too tight to redo the credits. Cain's works include the chess game set at which we meet Kronstein in From Russia With Love, the Piz Gloria sets in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and the various locations throughout Live and Let Die, including, and we can include a number of gadgets which appeared throughout the series. Cain had a hand in designing those, so maybe he's an unofficial assistant to Q Branch. His final involvement with the series was as a storyboard artist on Goldeneye. When you think of the James Bond films, I bet the familiar guitar riff is coming to mind. That distinct riff from the now legendary theme to the series was composed by Monty Norman for Dr. No, and serves as the film's overall theme, doubling as incidental music along the way. It can be a bit silly now to have the Bond theme blaring as Bond checks his room for bugs and things, but it just worked at the time. As I said, it does pop up for fairly mundane things, but it's all part of the charm. Norman composed the theme song along with the score for Dr. No, but Broccoli and Saltzman asked John Barry to provide a different arrangement as they were unhappy with Norman's original arrangement. John Barry would later claim he wrote the James Bond theme, but Monty Norman would win 2 libel actions against Barry's claims, though these claims stated that he wrote it for Monty Norman to help him out, and allowed Norman to be given credit in exchange for a flat fee. The most recent of these was actually 2001. John Barry is generally the composer we think of when it comes to the scores of the Bond films, however. He would score 11 of the 14 films following Dr. No. While it was officially ruled that Monty Norman composed the James Bond theme, Barry would provide a secondary theme of sorts with the piece titled 007, which, among other occasions, such as throughout the Connery films, plays during the sequence at the Romani camp in From Russia With Love, and on occasion in Thunderball, You Only Live Twice, films like that. The distinct style he would create for the films was considered perfected in Goldfinger and sort of built on a little from there, with plenty of powerful brass and jazz elements, along with a little influence from Russian composers which was present in all his film scores. Barry was also the sole creator for the theme to On Her Majesty's Secret Service, a powerful instrumental which doubles as a chase theme as Bond escapes Blofeld's forces through the Alps. Other memorable sequences enhanced by his work are the assault on Fort Knox, the scene where spacecraft from Russia and America are captured by Spectre's mechanisms, and the love scenes of On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which were accompanied by his favourite Bond composition, We Have All the Time in the World, beautifully sung by Louis Armstrong. The main themes of each film are his work with various co-creators, at least up until the point he retired. Lyricist Don Black occasionally accompanied him, and they would often work on a number of projects across various films. The songs generally remain pretty strong and very memorable. I'll go a little more in depth on them later where I can, but suffice to say, with songs like Goldfinger and Thunderball setting the scene for their respective films, Barry's work here sustained his quality. Interestingly, he did not compose the score for Live and Let Die, as he was working on the stage musical Bill. George Martin would provide the score for that film, which is why he wanted Paul McCartney to perform the title theme. It's no surprise it's such a solid song, being the best charting Bond theme of the time. Barry returned for The Man with the Golden Gun, though he did not work on The Spy Who Loved Me due to tax reasons, with Marvin Hamlish providing a somewhat disco-inspired score that still manages to be very impressive, and giving us one of the best songs in the series in the form of Nobody Does It Better. Barry then worked on the films up to and including The Living Daylights. He added in modern elements to the title theme of A View to a Kill while keeping the score in his style, and the result was the only Bond theme to be a #1, and probably a better song than the film it's attached to deserves. Aha's Paul Vakhtar complimented the work Barry did on writing The Living Daylights, managing to blend the band's sound with Bond tradition, and it is frankly a very good and striking piece. Fragile health after throat surgery meant Barry could not complete the score for License to Kill. Michael Kamen finished that, and Eric Serra composed the electronic and industrial-inspired score for Goldeneye, which was a bit controversial. Barry recommended David Arnold to score the films after hearing an album of Arnold's rearrangements of various Bond movie music, and Arnold would work from Tomorrow Never Dies until Quantum of Solace, with Thomas Newman composing for Skyfall and Spectre, while Hans Zimmer provided No Time to Die's score. The title songs do tend to steal the show, but the music for the films themselves is always worth listening to. You'll be impressed if you do take time out to sit down and listen to them. Films need good scores to stand out, and the Bond series has generally got that right. I mean, if you get the music right, you've got quite a lot of other things that can fall into place. For example, it's been said the one thing you cannot fault about Star Wars is John Williams. The script writers also need to be thanked, since they are the ones who start the whole process, creating the skeleton around which all other parts provide the flesh. Richard Maybaum wrote, or was one of the writers for, the majority of the scripts from Dr. No to License to Kill, and he brought significant skill to the role. In fact, he was brought in because the original script writer wasn't satisfactory and had the stupid idea of having Dr. No as some sort of monkey god. Yeah, the original drafts of Dr. No, according to some of the things I've uncovered, were pretty ridiculous and there were some daft ideas involved. Thankfully, Maybaum did rewrite it to make it closer to the original novel. Maybaum's plays, written during the 1930s, were quite famous in America. His play The Tree was the first major anti-lynching play performed, and Birthright was the first anti-Nazi play to reach Broadway. He had many other plays and films which confronted important societal matters. His original connection with Broccoli was working with Warwick Films, and then they brought him on to fix Dr. No. He would receive co-credits on the first 4 Bond films, though was not used for You Only Live Twice. Roald Dahl was the writer for that film, and it probably explains why it seems a bit silly at times. It's an entertaining film, but maybe just a little silly. Maybaum would get sole credit for On Her Majesty's Secret Service, though for the next 2 films, Tom Mankiewicz was used. Mankiewicz, and I apologise about the pronunciation again, started his film career as a third assistant director on The Comancheros in 1961, and began trying his hand at screenwriting by developing a script titled Please, about the last 90 minutes in the life of a suicidal actress. It was never made into a film, but people reading over it wound up giving him his first formal screenwriting credits. Mankiewicz admitted he felt a fair bit of pressure given his father, Joseph L. Mankiewicz, was a celebrated screenwriter of his own accord, but he managed to get consistent work before being brought in to work on Diamonds Are Forever in the hope of luring Sean Connery back to the role. He was hired for 2 weeks, was ultimately kept on for 6 months, and earned a co-credit with Richard Maybaum. He was the sole writer for Live and Let Die, received a co-credit on The Man with the Golden Gun since he felt a bit burned out and Maybaum would fix the script, and assisted in an uncredited capacity on The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker. Maybaum would be working with Christopher Wood on The Spy Who Loved Me, while Christopher Wood was preferred as the sole script writer for Moonraker. Maybaum would return to work alongside Michael G. Wilson on For Your Eyes Only, and that team would remain until License to Kill. Opinion will of course differ on the scripts and how effective they are, as there have been many contributors alongside Maybaum, but his work generally provided a touch of humour to make the mood that bit lighter and bring the audiences back to their seats after the action. Maybaum's work is also a bit more serious than Mankiewicz's was, and Roald Dahl's own screenplay. Doubtless an aspect honed from his many well-regarded plays and other movie scripts. Neil Purvis and Robert Wade have written the scripts from The World Is Not Enough onwards. They're a prominent screenwriting duo from British film whose credits include Let Him Have It, a film based on real events about a boy who is controversially hanged after getting involved with gangs, and Plunkett & McLean, the film which brought them to Barbara Broccoli's attention. They describe their work as a means of playing to an actor's strengths, and their work with Daniel Craig's films earned plenty of accolades for the differing approaches to the Bond films of old. Casino Royale would in fact be nominated for a BAFTA for its script, an indicator of an impending trend where the series would finally start receiving major acknowledgement and be a bit better written overall. Admittedly, the script writing did run into a few problems during the massive writers' strike of 2007-2008, and Daniel Craig actually had to wind up helping out rewrite the script on the fly, and there were some problems with Spectre along the way. But overall, things have generally been pretty well and been able to ground a more realistic and serious Bond, with a lot of people giving credit to Purvis and Wade for effectively having Bond go through a midlife crisis in Skyfall and make it believable. I'll go into some info on the directors to wrap it up. Terence Young directed Dr. No, From Russia with Love, and Thunderball. He had already worked with Warwick Films, so Broccoli knew his level of skill quite well. Young had built his career as a screenwriter in the 1940s, moving behind the camera in the late 40s and 50s. He would work with Audrey Hepburn on a few occasions, which led to an interesting connection between the two. Young had served as a tank commander during World War II and participated in the fighting around Arnhem Bridge, where a teenage Hepburn lived. The two would playfully claim Young had been shelling his favourite actress without knowing it. The character of Sylvia Trench was actually Terence Young's idea, though her role did not continue after From Russia with Love. His directorial career would flourish greatly after the Bond films, and he would continue to get a lot of work, but his career did take a massive blow after the disastrous Inchon and the fiasco surrounding that, and that's kind of an in-depth tale for another day. Worth noting, Young took Sean Connery under his wing, introduced him to his tailor, and helped him get the feel for the sort of person James Bond was. As Connery was still very much a working-class Scot at heart, and in a way I suppose he remained that. Guy Hamilton directed Goldfinger, Diamonds Are Forever, Live and Let Die, and The Man with the Golden Gun. Hamilton had also built his career in the post-war years, working as an assistant director to Alexander Korda and Carol Reed, before becoming a full-fledged director in the 1950s. He built quite a strong film resume but turned down the opportunity to direct Dr. No. He did feel he was successful in conveying the feel of the series with Goldfinger, and in fact many still hold this as a prime example of how the cinematic 007 should be conveyed. He would continue to direct through the 1960s, but after the Bond films of the 70s, he gradually directed less and less. He said that he did not enjoy working on The Man with the Golden Gun, it was the only Bond film he regretted, though he did claim he advised Roger Moore not to try and mimic Sean Connery. Moore would wind up growing into his own with The Spy Who Loved Me, so there's some credibility to that. Lewis Gilbert directed You Only Live Twice and would later be called on to direct the similar in theme The Spy Who Loved Me. Seriously, The Spy Who Loved Me is basically You Only Live Twice but with submarines and a supertanker, and Moonraker. Gilbert actually has a pretty wide-reaching resume with films such as Reach for the Sky, the original Alfie, and Educating Rita among his credits. He began his career as a child actor before joining the RAF's film unit, and continued to show his talents after the war by directing a number of films and documentaries. He would often work as a writer and producer, and the films tended to be based around real events from World War II. That film, Reach for the Sky, is about the pilot Douglas Bader, who was famous for having metal legs. The successes of those films earned him the reputation that led to further success with Alfie, and later the work on the 3 Bond films. He initially had to be persuaded to direct You Only Live Twice, but took the job and returned for the 2 films in the late 70s before settling down with smaller scale films in the 80s and still enjoying a bit of success. Peter Hunt, who deserves a lot of credit as a major editor of the films in the Connery and Lazenby era, with his tight and fast-paced work contributing much to the atmosphere of the series in those early days, worked as an editor for Alexander Korda at first, and developed a strong resume as an editor, befriending John Glenn, who would also direct Bond films. Hunt honed his sharp, quick cutting style on the first 3 Bond films, helping them flow really well, and aimed to become a director since he had some experience in the field. He was passed over for You Only Live Twice and very nearly quit, but ultimately stayed on thanks to the promise of directing a future instalment. On Her Majesty's Secret Service was that film, and it benefits greatly from his editing experience. He wanted to be able to put his stamp on a film. He would also direct Chitty Chitty Bang Bang for Albert Broccoli, but On Her Majesty's Secret Service was his last involvement with the Bond series. Speaking of John Glenn, he started his career as messenger for film studios, before building a career as a sound and visual editor with Shepperton Studios. He too would also work with Alexander Korda, as mentioned above, assisting on films like The Third Man, before moving up in the ranks to eventually start directing during the 1960s. He would work with Roger Moore on The Wild Geese. He worked with Moore on 11 films overall, and tended to have an overall preference to work with actors many times, and assisted on Superman as well. He contributed to On Her Majesty's Secret Service, The Spy Who Loved Me, and Moonraker before becoming the series director. Glenn would direct all 5 films made in the 1980s, and has directed the most Bond films as a result. His films share a couple of noticeable recurring elements. All his Bond films feature a character who dies by falling to their death, and an animal which startles the audience, usually in the form of a pigeon. He was the one who put the stupid double-taking pigeon in Moonraker. Since Goldeneye, the directors have tended to vary a bit more, but some did return. Martin Campbell directed Goldeneye and Casino Royale. He was considered for other Bond films beforehand, but found the scripts limiting and wanted to work with a new actor, getting his chance to start the reboot and doing a damn good job. Roger Spottiswoode directed Tomorrow Never Dies, and the prestigious Michael Apted, well known for his work on the Up documentary series, which charted the lives of several people at 7-year intervals along with a number of noted films, directed The World Is Not Enough. Lee Tamahori, perhaps best known for the Confronting Once Were Warriors, the film about a violent Maori family which put Tamura Morrison on the international stage, directed Die Another Day, and Mark Forster directed Quantum of Solace, becoming the youngest director for the series in the process. He had already built a pretty solid resume with films like Monsters Ball, Finding Neverland and The Kite Runner, so he definitely had the skill. Sam Mendes, whose prestigious career would take quite some time to examine but involves many theatrical, directorial and production credits to the point he was knighted for services to cinema and entertainment in 2020, directed both Skyfall and Spectre. Danny Boyle was meant to direct No Time to Die, but a number of behind-the-scenes issues meant Kerry Joji Fukunaga came on board to direct the film, having originally been considered for Spectre, before negotiations with Mendes ultimately saw him return to direct Spectre. There are plenty of other people who've worked on the films, and they all deserve a lot of credit, but this is about all I've got time for, really. We can probably find some more information later on, and it's probably worth looking up the likes of the costume designers as well, because there are some pretty splendid outfits in the film. There's a lot to check out, honestly, and there are so many behind-the-scenes people who bring these films to life. It's not just the actors. Take a look at the credits, perhaps check a few names out, see if there's anyone you recognise, or people who've worked on major films, because they all contribute significantly. Okay, this one better have been a long lesson, because that took quite some time to complete 00 Agent. The best strategy is to abuse the guard's AI. Basically kite them. Because enemies, if they have a clear line of sight to you, can shoot you. However, certain things, such as larger obstacles like the engine in Frigate, count as walls. You can shoot over those, but they won't react to you because they think there's a wall there. Also, if they have to go through choke points, that's a big disadvantage for them. Basically, as you saw, what I did was constantly kite them back to the cell, shoot them when they tried to come through the door. This way I avoided having a lot of guards come at me. There was patience at the start, but you also have to remember that the KF-7 is quieter when you zoom in. It's still a ridiculously loud gun, and throwing knives kinda suck. Speaking of throwing knives, that's our cheat. 2 times throwing knives. I do not really like going in for throwing knives. I am a god-awful shot with throwing knives. You know how bad I am with guns. Throwing knives don't work with the auto-aim. Let's just go back to the bunker. Go on 00 agent and we can fight off crowds of enemies. So, I'm also tiny. And I'm fast! So, we've got 10 throwing knives. A double dose of throwing knives at least helps. But I'm still a terrible shot with them. Okay, we can have 12 throwing knives. I am very small. At least you can recover your throwing knives when you inevitably make a really bad throw. But yeah, throwing knives would probably be better on DK mode when I'm normal height. Tiny Bond just sort of messes things up a bit. But I can at least hit them in the head a bit more efficiently. Still, that's basically what 2 times throwing knives does. Oh, there we are. You can essentially just run around and hit people with knives, but note how Bond is carrying them. He carries them in a sort of pistol grip. That's a really good way to cut your hand open. It's not the best, to be honest. Throwing knives are fairly handy as commando weapons, but of course you do have to wind up timing your throws just right if you really want to... Oh well, let's get some guns out. You do have to wind up timing your throws right if you want to do anything with them. Because, I mean, in fiction the blade always goes in. The blade always hits its target and stabs somebody. Interestingly enough, there's an aversion to this in the James Bond series, specifically for special services. Bond actually does do a bit of knife throwing, dispatching some goons ostensibly working for Marcus Bismarcker. He doesn't actually kill them. The one guy he does get with a throwing knife is actually knocked out. Bond times his throw so that the pommel of the knife hits him between the eyes and knocks him out. It's actually pretty clever. I mean, they're very useful in that sort of stealth sense, but they're not my favorite. How did that guy die? Oh, the computer got blown up because one of his mates was shooting at him. Friendly fire and then some. So yeah, throwing knives are not a weapon I prefer. One of my housemates, on the other hand, he was amazing with throwing knives. He would generally blow himself up just because it was funny. Like, you'd be fighting and then there'd be a wave of explosions accompanying the bald civilian. I think that's the one that uses Graham Norgate's model. Some characters use specific models. I think one of the Moonraker elites uses Grant's character model. We know that the male scientist is basically Dr. Doak. And, yeah. So, some of the characters in multiplayer do use very specific models. I think there are female scientists. There's a female scientist as well. I think a few interesting things that weren't actually used in the game. Because there was going to be an all Bonds cheat, actually, but unfortunately United Artists asked them to drop that one. Of course, the developers did decide they had to go out in style, and so they had one last matchup. Oh, I didn't get those documents. An epic first to 100 death match with all the Bonds. Apparently, I think it was Martin Hollis who was playing as Roger Moore and won by 1 kill. That would have been something to see, to put it lightly. But yeah, throwing knives, handy stealth weapon, help you build up your ammunition and things like that, but really not the best when it comes to dealing with large groups of enemies. They're much better as a quick, quiet way to dispatch one adversary. It's also really annoying that guards can shoot through other guards and you can't. At least not until you get stronger weapons. But yeah, that pretty much sums up everything on the bunker. We don't have to deal with Severnaya, but we are heading to St. Petersburg, where the movie picks up next time. And it is interesting to note that our next level, Statue, does indeed have parallels in real life. There are lots and lots of basically dumping grounds for old Soviet-era statuary. It's another beautiful aspect of symbolism, that idea of change, the way the old world is being left behind, how politics is shifting. It's quite fascinating, really. There we are. We'll get some more silliness switches later on, but I don't really think I want to use Tiny Bond that much. I did show that Tiny Bond can float. Yeah, I took a very long time to actually do that, so hopefully future me has waffled on a bit. But we got there. We got there in the end. And we are ready to go to St. Petersburg and Statue Park. Thank you very much for joining me. Till next time, this is Red 2 returning to base.